The time of the year known as Halloween is an exciting event for those who celebrate. For the older participants, it normally represents a time that signifies a changing of the seasons. Haunted houses, all things spooky and scary, and comfortable sweaters. For children, it means candy and costumes and the chance to create some of the most wonderful memories of their childhood. It is a beautiful time, full of tradition and vibrant colors. Having celebrated it their entire lives, there are many people who don't know the true story of Halloween, its origins, traditions, and many symbols that are related to it. In the first part of this episode, we'll discuss the early traditions of Halloween and how it became the exciting and often commercial phenomena that it is today. And because this subject matter is very light, for the second half of the episode, I have a favorite spooky story to tell you that will set your Halloween season off on the right foot. For what exactly that story is, you'll just have to keep listening. Now, let's get into our episode. Hello everyone, and thanks for coming back for another chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast, and officially welcome you to Spooky Season 2022. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on this week's episode, we're going to discuss the origins of everyone's favorite fall event, Halloween. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn down your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're not. Now, follow along to the sound of my voice, and let's get into our story. The word Halloween dates all the way back to the year 1745 and is of the Christian religion in its origin. It is derived from the Scottish term for All Hallows Eve, and the word itself means Evening of the Saints. The event is believed to have its history rooted in the beliefs and practices of the Christian faith. In modern day, we use the name Halloween to describe All Hallows Eve, which takes place the evening before All Hallows Day, better known as All Saints' Day, which occurs on the 1st of November, and the following All Souls' Day on the 2nd. Since the foundations of early Christianity, major holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and the Pentecost have had vigils that begin the night before the event. This is especially prevalent to the common listener when you think of such things as Christmas Eve Mass. The 3 days together form an event called the All Hallow Tide, which is a time for honoring saints and to pray for the departed souls of friends and family to reach heaven. In early Christianity, saints and martyrs were honored on very different dates, but largely occurred in the springtime. The Romans, in the 4th century, used to celebrate this on the 13th of May. Because of this special day, in the year 609, Pope Boniface IV rededicated the Roman Pantheon to Saint Mary and all martyrs. This also coincided with Lemuria, the ancient Roman festival in which the dead were celebrated. This festival was largely used for performing rites in order to exorcise malevolent and evil spirits from their homes. As the centuries progressed, by the year 800, evidence began to emerge that feasts commemorating the saints were being held on the 1st of November. It was believed that this celebration spread into the Frankish Empire as well, through members of the court of Charlemagne, and in 835, it was officially adopted into the Frankish calendar. Other cultures, such as the Germanic and Celtic peoples, were believed to have celebrated this at the coming of winter, which was significant as it also represented the death of nature. By the end of the 12th century, Christianity had adopted these days for good. Traditions, such as the ringing of church bells for souls in purgatory and parades in the streets for the ringing of bells, were held for the memory of poor souls. During this period, another custom was born, which was the baking and sharing of soul cakes to remember all Christian souls. These cakes were small, round, and were described as having the consistency of shortbread and were sweetened with spices. These cakes would be given out to people known as soulers, who largely consisted of children and poor persons. These soulers would go from door to door during the 3 days of the All Hallow Tide and would sing and say prayers for the souls of the givers and their friends. This custom, which resembles a very early version of the Halloween and trick-or-treating that we know and celebrate today, it continued in places like England until the 1930s. There are even places such as Portugal and the Philippines that continue this practice today. There were also many other traditions that were associated with souling. Lanterns, much like those we make out of pumpkins today, used to be made out of turnips, and children used to take these from door to door as they represented souls trapped in purgatory. Children would even go out in disguise, some wearing long black cloaks, while others would go in costume. This was meant as a tribute to the saints and an imitation of spirits. Another key tradition was the lighting of bonfires and candles. These were said to ward off evil spirits. Candles were often carried between the hours of 11 p.m. and midnight for a custom known as lading the witches. If the candles continued to burn, then the witch's powers could not affect the candle holder. However, if the candle burnt out before midnight, it was believed that evil would soon follow. Where the 1st of November was attributed to All Saints' Day, many people continued the practice of certain divination games up to the evening before. It became customary to crack nuts, duck for apples in a tub of water, and perform many different fireside revelries. And it would be through a Christian minister named Prince Sori Conte that the wearing of costumes were actually linked to vengeful ghosts. He said that it was traditionally believed that the souls of the departed wandered the earth until All Saints' Day, and All Hallows' Eve provided one last chance for the dead to gain vengeance on their enemies before moving on to the next world. In order to avoid being recognized by any soul that might be seeking such vengeance, people would don masks or costumes. This may also have arose from the fact that churches were too poor in the Middle Ages to display religious artifacts, and thus let children dress up as saints. The dressing in costume also helped people in France to hide from an event known as the Danse Macabre, which once a year, on Halloween, the dead were said to arise in churchyards for one hideous carnival. This practice would come under attack during a period in the 16th century known as the Reformation, due to the fact purgatory was seen as a Catholic belief and was thrown out by the Protestants. Ceremonies to commemorate the souls of the dead in purgatory were even abolished in their entirety during the Elizabethan Reform. This may have seemed like the end for Halloween. However, Catholics and Protestants alike continued the souling and candlelit processions. At this time, as noted by Mark Donnelly, a professor in medieval archaeology, barns and homes began to be blessed to protect people and livestock from the effects of witches who would accompany malevolent spirits as they traveled the earth. Because of the ending of ceremonies to the dead, this led to new All-Hallowtide customs being born, especially as the festivities of All Hallows' Eve began to be overshadowed, specifically in England, by the 5th of November's Guy Fawkes Night. In other countries, like Italy, families would leave out a meal for the ghosts of their deceased relatives before leaving for church services. Parish priests would go from house to house, asking for small gifts of food, which were shared amongst one another throughout the evening. In modern-day Spain, the continuance of baking pastries they call the Huesos de Santo, or Bones of the Holy, are made and placed on graves. There, Christian priests also lead processions throughout the All-Hallowtide, and vigils are kept throughout each of the 3 nights. Many of our modern-day Halloween practices are believed to extend from folk customs of Celtic peoples in their countries, many of which have pagan roots. In Ireland, it's believed that there was an intermingling between Christian and pre-Christian religions with respect to Halloween that points to the Gaelic festival, which was known as Samhain. Samhain is one of the quarter days in the medieval Gaelic calendar and has been celebrated from the 31st of October to the 1st of November. This festival is observed by Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. It marks the end of the harvest season and the first day of winter, and celebrates the transition into the darker half of the year. It was from this observance that the idea of the thinning of the veil between our world and the other world was formed. This meant that it was easier for spirits to come into our world and be very active, known as the AOC. The purpose of Samhain was for the living to appease the spirits and ensure that both people and livestock would survive the winter. They would make offerings of food and drink and place them outside their homes. It was said they would revisit their old homes, and even places for dinner would be set on the table for them. Candles would be lit, and prayers said for the souls of the departed, and then, once those were taken care of, the feasting and games would begin. During the 16th century, the practices of mumming and guising became big in Ireland. This involved people in disguises going from house to house, offering songs in exchange for food. This practice is still done today in the Canadian province of Newfoundland, but is more closely associated with Christmas Eve than Halloween. This is even seen as an evolutionary step to the medieval practice of souling. In some parts of the world, this would even include a man dressed as Lair Bon, or White Mare, who would lead children to different houses to recite verses and songs. If food was donated, the house was said to receive good fortune. In Scotland, this looked slightly different than in Ireland, Often, children would don costumes and paint their faces, threatening to do acts of mischief if they were not welcomed. This may, or may not, sound like a popular Halloween saying used today. These practices didn't catch on in England until the 19th century, and it wouldn't be until the 20th century that the hollowed-out turnips would become known as jack-o'-lanterns. When the European expansion into North America came, the traditions of All Hallowtide didn't come over in full force right away. Some of the earlier Anglican and Catholic colonists didn't recognize All Hallows Eve on their calendars. However, when the mass migrations of Scottish and Irish immigrants began to come over in the 19th century, Halloween quickly became a major holiday in North America. Because of these immigrants, we're thankful to have many of the Halloween customs we take part in today. It would be in the early 20th century that the concept of Halloween would spread from coast to coast in North America, and the late 20th, early 21st century to mainland Europe. As we move out of the history of Halloween into what it has become today, we must next examine what are the symbolic things that make Halloween so great. The first and most prominent is the jack-o'-lantern. Historic hollowed-out turnips, and now modern-day pumpkins, are representative of a soul who has been denied entry into both heaven and hell, and now exists in purgatory. There is a popular Irish Christian folktale that's associated with this that goes as follows. En route home, after a night's drinking, Jack encounters the devil and tricks him into climbing a tree. A quick-thinking Jack etches the sign of the cross into the bark, thus trapping the devil. Jack strikes a bargain with Satan so that he can never claim his soul. After a life of sin, drink, and mendacity, Jack is refused entry into heaven when he dies. Keeping his promise, the devil refuses to let Jack into hell and throws a live coal straight from the fires of hell at him. It was a bitter cold night, so Jack placed the coal in a hollowed-out turnip to stop it from going out, since which time Jack and his lantern have been roaming the earth, looking for a place to rest. So with this story, why switch from the historical uses of a turnip to that of a pumpkin? The first recorded instance of carving pumpkins comes from 1837 and was associated with the time of harvest. Originally, the carving of pumpkins was associated strictly with this and didn't become associated with Halloween until the late 19th century. This was largely because pumpkins are larger and softer, which makes them a lot easier to carve than a turnip. In modern day, we have moved away from the concept of the spirits of our deceased relatives and friends coming back to greet us on All Hallows Eve, to Halloween being more known for versions of mischievous ghosts and evil spirits. This has largely been due to the influence of Gothic and horror subjects being commonplace in popular culture. It was believed to have been brought on by the early iterations of Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Mummy. Images of skulls are also quite frequent. This is in reference to the Christian faith and the crucifixion of Christ in Golgotha. It's a reminder of the death and transitory properties of human existence. It was brought on by the artworks of Memento Mori and Vanitas, which touch on similar things to Halloween. Of course, also taking part around the fall and the time of harvest, other elements such as autumn, corn husks, leaves, and scarecrows are also major symbols of Halloween. In darker elements, death, evil, cryptids, black cats, and witches are as well. And of course, the colors, black, orange, and sometimes purple, have been adopted as Halloween's traditional colors. But out of all, how did these colors come to be selected? When you think about it, It largely ties into what the Celtic peoples were celebrating, the tradition from autumn to winter, the end of the harvest before the cold sets in. Orange is representative of the warmth of the autumn season and the last harvest, which gives way to the death of nature, and the color black, for this symbolizes the cold, dark winter that lays ahead of us. This explains orange and black, the traditional colors, but how does the color purple factor into Halloween? It's widely understood that purple is the symbolic color of all things that are of a spiritual and mystical nature. It's a connection to religious rituals, owing to the fact it's a color often worn by priests. There also exists the modern belief that purple has become accepted into Halloween due to commercialism, as it also relates to children and laughter. With the darker nature of the North American Halloween culture, it's very popular at this time of year to visit haunted attractions and venues, such as haunted houses or corn mazes. The first known haunted attraction was built in 1915 in England and was known as the Orton and Spooner Ghost House. It wouldn't be until the 1930s when haunted houses, along with trick-or-treating, really began to come over to North America. This would all build towards Halloween becoming mainstream and commercialized in the 1950s. California was actually the first to really buy into the hype, opening their first haunted house in 1958 in San Bernardino. It would only be about 10 years later when it would really catch on commercially when the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland was built on the 12th of August in 1969. It continued to build in popularity with the opening of the first Hell House in 1972. Full theme parks would even dedicate entire periods of time to Halloween and spooky themed events. The first was Six Flags Fright Fest, which opened in 1986, followed by Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios in Florida in 1991. Universal's Halloween-themed events have even spread to their locations in Singapore and Japan. Another major element of Halloween is food. In traditional Christianity, All Hallows Eve encourages abstinence from meat. In the Northern Hemisphere, it also coincides with apple harvests, so candy apples and caramel apples have become common Halloween treats. These were originally given out as treats for Halloween. However, there have been instances reported of foreign objects being embedded in them, so this was quickly abandoned in favor of commercialized sealed candy packages. With Halloween being a Western celebration, rooted in Christianity and paganism, how do other religions of the world celebrate Halloween? In Judaism, it's not permitted due to the Jewish halakha, as it forbids Jews from partaking in gentle customs. Although they don't celebrate Halloween, they do celebrate Yizkor 4 times a year, which is similar to the All Hallowtide, in which prayers are read for oneself and one's family. That being said, many North American Jews do celebrate Halloween, omitting its Christian parts. In Islam, it has been ruled that Muslims should not participate in Halloween as, in some circles, participating in Halloween is worse than participation in Christmas or Easter. There are others who permit the participation in Halloween so long as it is not declared an Eid, and that the behavior of its participants is in line with the Islamic principles. For Hindu practitioners, they do not celebrate All Hallowtide, but remember their dead during the festival of Pitru Paksha. During this, Hindus pay respects to and perform a ceremony to keep the souls of their ancestors at rest. This is normally celebrated during the month of Bhadrapada around mid-September. Additionally, sometimes the festival of Diwali conflicts with Halloween, but many do choose to partake in the popular customs of Halloween. For those who practice the religions of neo-paganism or Wicca, there is no set rule for the observance of Halloween. They, instead, observe the ancient festival of Samhain on the 1st of November, although they are more than welcome to observe both if they so choose. There are different streams of thought amongst the neo-pagans, believing that trick-or-treaters can interrupt their practices. Wiccans, on the other hand, don't celebrate Halloween, although it is a very important day for them. On the 31st of October, beginning at sundown, they begin the celebration of Samhain. Although this is rooted in medieval and Celtic practice, they don't observe the same rituals and practices their ancestors did. There are some of the old rituals that are practiced, but it's largely used to celebrate darkness and the dead. Needless to say, the way Halloween is celebrated today is easy to trace the foundations of. From its medieval beginnings, all the way through the mass migrations of Irish and Scottish immigrants in the 19th century, the majority of how Halloween is celebrated around the world today can be attributed to the popularity of the holiday and its commercialism that has been brought on and popularized by the United States and Canada. And because of this, it was able to spread to the majority of the world, where it's celebrated, even in its most basic and minimal of forms, by most countries. And that will wrap up part 1 of our podcast, discussing the history of traditions of Halloween. But, owing to this podcast discussing things of a more dark and scary nature, it's time to turn things up a little bit. To this point in our episode, it has been relatively lighthearted and easy to listen. But, kicking off spooky season and being in the first week of October, I wanted to share a story with you. The story comes from a website known as Creepypasta and was written by an author who remains unknown. So, to get your spooky season off right, coming up after this, we're going to get into the story known as the Russian sleep experiment. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so that gas didn't kill them, since it was very toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, running water, and a toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past lives. The general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win and trust the experiments by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs. For 3 hours straight, he continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives tear the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped, and so did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming out with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from their captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. Over the speaker, they announced,
"We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor where you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom."
To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice respond,
"We no longer want to be freed."
Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the gas stimulant and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and the soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call that state that any of them were in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject's thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking it and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the floor was actually covered in blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds inflicted that most, if not all, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tracts of all four could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that they were digesting what was their own flesh, that they had begun to rip off and eat over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. The subjects continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off, and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured, and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of a doctor in the process. His heart was even seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out to the point that there was no more air in his vascular system. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word more over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas and demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles, that were still attached to his skeleton, were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle not to be subdued. Most of them were from the force of his own muscles that he had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to have started screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery. He only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, The subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried, asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given.
I must remain awake.
All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again, just for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper, scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as one who just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject still restrained to the bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled.
Have you forgotten so easily?
The subject asked.
We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment, in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go into the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread.
The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out.
So, nearly free.
If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story about the history of Halloween and a reading of the Russian sleep experiment. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about the podcast and the complete slate of episodes I've got planned for Spooky Season 2022, please visit the link tree in the show notes. And before you go, remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our weekly stories to come. If you like this episode, I'd ask you to share it with a friend. And please come back next week to learn the story of Arne Johnson and the famous court case synonymous with the phrase, "The devil made me do it." New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.